The dropship trembled as it pierced through the stormy atmosphere of X9 Cristar, a barren moon orbiting a gas giant deep in the neutral zone of the Sirius system. Sheets of icy mist battered the exterior, and frost crept along the windows in growing veins. Inside, 13 cadets from 12 different alien species braced themselves in silence. Each had trained for years at the Galactic Academy, each selected for this final test, one meant to filter out the weak and elevate the exceptional. The mission briefing had been clear. Survive 72 hours on the surface of Cristar with only the standard-issue survival pack and whatever the moon provided. No drones, no tech support, no communication beyond short-range emergency beacons. Only instincts, endurance, and innovation would determine who passed, or who froze. Cadet Tracy Green sat quietly near the rear of the cabin. She was the only human on this mission, the only representative of Earth in this elite squad. She had brown hair braided tightly against her head, dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights of pre-mission anxiety, and a pair of cold, reinforced gloves clenched tightly in her lap. She knew how others viewed her: fragile, slow-evolving, a death worlder who barely earned her place among genetically perfected alien species. She had heard the whispers during training, seen the looks, felt the dismissive tone from some professors who couldn't understand why a human cadet had made it this far. Across from her, Cadet Zor, a broad-shouldered silicarn with translucent skin and a natural exosuit that adapted to the cold, sneered in her direction. He wasn't trying to hide it. She ignored him. His breath steamed in the cold air, despite the ship's internal heat regulation. Even he seemed to feel the chill creeping into the cabin. That was saying something. The dropship's computer announced their descent was complete. A moment later, the hatch opened, letting in a blast of cutting wind and a blinding glare from the twin suns reflecting off endless fields of blue ice and jagged crystalline peaks. The temperature instantly dropped, slapping exposed skin with a bite sharp enough to draw tears. Tracy stepped out last, letting the others disembark ahead of her. She knew she would be underestimated. She had counted on it. The surface of X9 Cristar stretched out like a hellish wonderland. Beautiful, treacherous, and vast. Glacial ridges rose like frozen waves in the distance, their edges glinting like shards of glass. Ice storms raged at the horizon. No vegetation, no visible shelter. Just an expanse of lethal white silence that could kill any unprepared organism in under an hour. An alien instructor stood before them, his body clad in reflective armor, eyes hidden beneath a visor. He raised his hand for silence, and despite the howl of the wind, everyone could hear him through the comlink embedded in their helmets. You have 72 standard hours. Survive. We will retrieve you at this exact location. Your packs contain 1 emergency beacon, 2 rations, thermal gloves, a fire starter, and a multi-tool. Use your species' strengths. That is all. The instructor stepped back into the dropship. The door hissed shut behind him. And then it was just the cadets, 13 of them. Some wasted no time. A Yulari female immediately darted across the snow, her quadruple-jointed limbs carrying her toward a distant ridge where heat vents were rumored to exist. A bulky Gravorn male slammed a stake into the ice, activating a domed temporary shelter that inflated with a mechanical hiss. Another cadet, a tall insectoid named Fezishi, began scanning the ground with thermal vision lenses built into her mask. Tracy stood still. Her boots sank slightly into the crusted snow as she surveyed the land. The wind clawed at her suit and her visor frosted over in seconds, forcing her to wipe it clean. Her breath came out in visible clouds, and she could already feel the cold seeping into the gaps of her collar. It wasn't just the cold. It was the kind of cold. The kind that didn't care about bravery or endurance. It only punished mistakes. She moved away from the others, pacing herself slowly. She knew better than to sprint like the Yulari or spend energy establishing a perimeter like the Gravorn. This place wasn't meant to be conquered. It had to be outlasted. That meant patience. After hiking for 10 minutes across uneven ground, she found a depression in the terrain, half sheltered by a crescent of shattered glacial boulders. It wasn't much, but it broke the wind and provided visual cover. Most importantly, it had a narrow trench running through it, maybe an old fault line or a collapsed ice tunnel. Her instincts stirred. That trench could hold trapped thermal energy from deep within the moon's core. If she was lucky, it might be just enough to offset the surface cold by a few degrees. She slid down into the trench and unpacked her gear. The cold was worsening now. Her hands trembled, even through the gloves. She moved quickly, not from panic, but from necessity. She laid out each item: the fire starter, the rations, the multi-tool, and a thin, reflective blanket. Useless alone, but together, maybe not. Tracy didn't believe in luck, but she did believe in Earth survival training. Her grandfather had taken her camping in Siberian forests before she even learned to tie her own boots. He taught her how to build insulated shelters from nothing, how to retain body heat using reflective surfaces, and how to cook tea using snow in a hollowed metal shell. That knowledge wasn't fancy, it wasn't galactically impressive, but it worked. She knelt in the trench, pulled her multi-tool apart, and began digging a narrow pocket into the ice wall, shaping it to form a dome. The ice was hard but not unworkable. As she worked, she thought of the others. They'd probably laughed at her absence by now, maybe even expected her to send out a distress beacon soon. Good, let them believe she was weak. That would give her time. Above her, the twin suns began to lower, casting the moon into long blue shadows. The temperature dropped another 6 degrees. Her suit's heating fibers flickered, then stabilized. Just barely. She couldn't count on it for long. Batteries failed fast in these temperatures. By nightfall, she had hollowed enough space to crawl inside. She lined the interior with the reflective blanket and jammed her pack at the entry to seal the opening. Then she took a small handful of dry snow, packed it tightly, and placed it into her metal cup. She activated the fire starter, watching the tiny orange flame flicker to life. Heat, fire, the most primitive tool of all, and still undefeated. As the water slowly melted, she leaned back against the ice wall and closed her eyes. Her muscles ached. Her fingers were numb, but her shelter was real. Her body was intact. Her mind was clear. She had survived the first day, and tomorrow she would do more than just survive. By the time the first of the twin suns disappeared beyond the frozen ridgelines of X9 Cristar, a different kind of silence settled over the moon. Not the silence of peace, but the brittle quiet of things failing, of confidence breaking down one icy crack at a time. Inside the shallow ice capsule she had constructed, Tracy opened her eyes to a faint blue flicker bouncing off the walls. The fire had long since dimmed to coals, but the heat lingered. Her thermal cup, still half of melted snow, radiated a weak warmth. It wasn't luxury, but it was life. She pulled her gloved hand to her face and peeled it back just enough to sip, her lips stinging as the heat touched frostbitten skin. The burn was welcome. Outside, the wind screamed louder now. The trench had spared her from the worst of it, but even so, the surface layer of her shelter had started frosting over again. Crystals formed along the edge of the entry gap. Her mind ticked through the essentials: heat, hydration, structural integrity, and then moved on to a new concern: the others. She had seen the Gravorn cadet tours setting up a kinetic dome. The device was meant for short-term survival, converting stored gravitational energy into a protective heat shell. On most planets, that tech would be reliable. But Cristar was not most planets. Here, tech betrayed its masters. The environment seemed to take particular pleasure in rejecting arrogance. Tracy secured the entry flap of her shelter and crawled outside. The moment her boots hit the snow, the wind pushed against her chest like a living wall. She adjusted her mask and checked the small sensor screen on her wrist. The outside temperature had dropped below -90. Human skin would freeze solid in seconds. Her suit was hanging on to function by a thread. She walked cautiously through the trench, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. Visibility was poor, and ice crystals lashed at her visor like fine sandpaper. She had no intention of wandering far, only far enough to find signs of movement, or worse, the lack of it. It didn't take long. She spotted the dome, half collapsed. Tors wasn't visible. The device's power core blinked red. She approached slowly and tapped the outer shell with her knuckle. It gave a hollow sound. No response. Tracy crouched and reached for the emergency release panel. She felt for the manual override, pressed it, and the dome hissed open. Tors lay curled inside, his breath shallow, eyes fluttering beneath heavy lids. His skin had changed from its usual obsidian hue to a pale, almost brittle silver. She cursed under her breath. His suit's thermal regulator had shut down. The dome's backup energy reservoir had frozen solid. She leaned in and shook his shoulder. His head rolled back. Still conscious, barely, she had no choice. She reached into her suit and pulled out her second emergency heat stick, something she'd been saving. Without hesitating, she jammed it between the plates of his armor at the chest seam and activated it. A brief pulse lit up the air around them, and his body jerked in response. His eyes opened fully, unfocused. "You're burning your backup," he whispered through a broken comm link. She didn't answer. She didn't care about the judgment. If he died out here, she would be responsible for knowing she could have done something and didn't. That wasn't acceptable. "Can you move?" she asked. His voice was failing, but he managed a nod. "Follow me. We'll go back to my shelter, slowly." It took the better part of an hour to get him moving. His limbs worked, but his coordination was shot. She walked ahead, checking every few steps to make sure he hadn't collapsed. When they reached her trench, he hesitated. "You dug this?" he rasped, his exhale fogging his visor. She ignored the question and pulled him inside. The space was barely enough for one person, let alone two, but necessity didn't care for comfort. She shifted her supplies, moved her own gear toward the wall, and propped him up against the insulated side. Then she reignited the fire starter. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the smooth blue ice. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was survival's silence. The sound of lungs adjusting to air that no longer hurt. Tors leaned back, his eyes slowly regaining their normal hue. "You were supposed to die first," he muttered. Tracy looked up. "That was the plan, was it? Wasn't personal. Everyone just assumed." "I know," she said, stirring the cup of now boiling snow water. She handed it to him. He stared at it. "Tea?" She nodded. "Peppermint, old earth recipe, helps with cold shock." He took the cup. It trembled in his hands, but he drank. Steam curled from his lips. The faintest smile cracked across his face, then faded. He handed the cup back. "You saved me." "Only because you'll owe me one," she replied. Tors's gaze turned serious. "It's not just me. I saw the others before I collapsed. Jix, he's not moving. Fergiche was trying to burrow into the ice, but her wings were frozen. I don't know about the rest." Tracy felt her stomach tighten. It was only the end of the first day, and already multiple cadets were close to death. The survival rate was supposed to be high. The Academy prided itself on equipping the best, but this test wasn't about technology or genetic superiority. It was about adaptability. "Stay here," she said. "Rest. I'll find them. You'll freeze." "Maybe," she said, standing again. "But I've got tea. That makes me invincible." Before he could argue, she climbed back out, tightening the seal behind her. Her cheeks were already stinging by the time she reached the trench's lip. The wind hadn't let up, and the stars had fully emerged above, sharp pinpoints of white scattered across a void so black it felt endless. She gripped the handle of her fire starter like a weapon and headed east, following the shallow depressions in the snow left by a Yllari's multiple footprints. The cold wasn't just physical anymore. It was becoming something alive, something that pressed into her thoughts, whispering weakness, tempting her to give in. She remembered her grandfather's voice. Soft, gruff, grounded in earth wisdom. The cold doesn't want to kill you, it wants you to do it for it. She wouldn't give it the satisfaction. Tracy pushed forward, every step a challenge against the razor-sharp wind that scoured the icy plain. Her visor had begun frosting from within, and she periodically had to lift her glove to wipe it clear with the edge of her sleeve. The peppermint warmth in her throat had long since faded, but the memory of it carried her. Somewhere ahead of her, Fergiche might still be alive, maybe. Jix was likely gone. She couldn't focus on the numbers. She focused on the possible. Her path curved around a ridge where a cluster of jagged ice spires jutted from the ground like frozen teeth. Between them, the snow was pitted with grooves and shallow holes. Tracy slowed. These weren't random formations. Someone, or something, had attempted to dig here. Her eyes caught the glimmer of an antenna. She hurried forward. Fergiche lay partially buried, her chitinous body curled into itself, her secondary limbs folded tight. One wing had cracked down the middle and frozen into that shape. Her breathing was shallow, visible only as faint clouds around the edges of her mouthpiece. The snow around her had been carved into shallow hollows, probably from a failed attempt to tunnel. Tracy knelt beside her and placed a hand against her upper thorax. The alien didn't move. Tracy didn't speak. She pulled a filament coil from her pouch, just 1 meter left, and wrapped it around Fezzichi's torso. Then she connected it to her firestarter's base. The coil ignited, glowing orange like a copper snake, emitting a pulsing heat wave just strong enough to push back the death creeping into the other girl's limbs. After nearly 3 minutes, Fezich stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing glossy black eyes that blinked several times before locking onto Tracy's face. Her mandibles trembled. "You, human, save your energy," Tracy said quietly. "Can you walk?" Fezich's antenna twitched twice. "Short distance, legs, slow, cold damage." "We'll go slowly," Tracy replied. The coil wouldn't last long. She unwound it and stuffed it back into her pouch, the ends already blackened and brittle. Then she wrapped one of Fezji's arms over her own shoulder and began leading her back. The wind didn't let up, but her direction was good. The trench reappeared through the drifting haze, and the outline of her shelter came into view. When she reached the edge and helped Fezichi down, Tors was already outside. He looked stronger. He had taken apart one of the ration heaters and fashioned it into a makeshift vent cover to keep their shelter insulated. When he saw Tracy hauling the insectoid cadet, he didn't say a word. He simply moved aside and cleared space. Tracy eased Feshi in and helped her curl against the wall where heat would concentrate. She then added snow to the steel cup and reignited the fire. The glow inside their cramped refuge made it feel almost sacred, like a hidden temple in a world that punished every warm-blooded thing. The tea brewed slowly. Fezichi didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her gratitude showed in the way her arms no longer trembled as much, and how she kept her damaged wing folded away from the flame without being told. Tors sipped first, then passed the cup to Fezichi, who struggled with the concept before copying the others. Her reaction was almost comical. Her eyes widened and her antennae arched upward, registering the heat, the flavor, and the stimulus. She drank the rest. That night, all three took turns sleeping. Tracy didn't sleep much. She leaned against the icy wall, staring into the flicker of the fire and thinking. This wasn't about surviving anymore. Something about this place, this test, had changed shape. It wasn't a proving ground. It was a reckoning. By morning, she had decided what needed to be done. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting gold across the endless snowfields. Tracy emerged from the trench with a purpose. The fire starter wouldn't last forever, neither would her rations. If she wanted to keep others alive, and more would come, she had to do something more permanent. She took stock of the supplies she had left. The multi-tool was still functional. The thermal blanket inside the shelter had done its job well, reflecting heat inward. But she needed more heat and more space. She had to scale the shelter up and make it sustainable. Her mind drifted to Earth, specifically to a documentary she had once watched about Arctic explorers. One of them had built a heating system from nothing but a metal can, a candle, and a pot of water. She didn't have candles, but she did have combustion strips. And she had metal, scattered fragments from Tors's failed dome, and part of the broken casing from Fezichi's scanning unit. For the next several hours, she worked in silence. First, she repurposed the debris, slicing and folding thin metal sheets using the heated blade of her multi-tool. She layered them to form a semicircle dome extension, big enough to house at least 5. Then she buried its base deep into the trench and reinforced the sides with compacted snow to create insulation. For heat, she used the coil one last time to jumpstart a layered combustion chamber made from Tors's kinetic dome regulator. The heat generated from the kinetic spark was weak, but she engineered a simple cycle that could store the energy into the metal basin, slowly warming a pot of water above it. She placed her steel cup on top, filled with snow. Within 20 minutes, the water bubbled. It was far from a reactor, but it worked. With careful management, the shelter would stay at survivable levels. The trick was airflow. Too much insulation, and the oxygen would deplete. Too little, and the wind would kill them. She made a vent flap using a piece of synthetic canvas, angled against the wind to allow filtered air to enter while keeping heat from escaping too quickly. She tested it herself, sitting inside the dome for over an hour. Her body temperature remained stable. She no longer had to rely entirely on the fire starter. The system was weak but self-sustaining. She stepped outside and inhaled sharply. The cold still stung, but it no longer frightened her. By sunset, another cadet arrived. This one, a tall, feline-like male named Rollin, was nearly unconscious. Tors saw him first and ran to get Tracy. Together, they pulled him in. His tail had frostbite, his breathing was erratic. But once Tracy gave him hot water and wrapped his limbs in insulating cloth, his condition stabilized. He stared at her after waking. "You built this?" She nodded. "We're not dying here." He blinked slowly. "This shelter, this setup, it's not in any manual. It's from Earth," she said, "camping, old-school style." Raylan laughed once, the sound weak but genuine. "You humans are insane." "Sometimes that's what it takes," she answered. By the end of the second night, the shelter held 4 cadets. Tracy didn't wait for thanks. She was already preparing for more. She had started melting snow in batches, rationing heat sources, and organizing rotations for guard duty and oxygen checks. Every hour she spent alive was no longer about passing an exam. It was about rewriting the expectations placed on her species. In the quiet moments between fixing torn suits and sealing cracks in the dome, she sometimes caught the others looking at her differently. Not as a fluke or a burden, but as something else. A leader. The realization was unfamiliar and unwelcome. She hadn't come here to lead. She came to prove she could survive. And yet now, with the shelter pulsing with heat and bodies stirring instead of freezing, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen when more cadets arrived. The cold hadn't given up. Neither had she. She drank a last sip of tea and stared out at the endless dark. The second night had ended. The real test was only beginning. The third day began not with light but with the tremor of footsteps crunching through hardened snow. Tracy snapped awake instantly, her fingers already gripping the fire starter she had kept beneath her thermal cloth. The others stirred behind her, bundled against the rounded inner wall of the shelter where the warmth remained strongest. Outside, faint voices echoed against the ice. She unsealed the flap and stepped into the pale blue dawn. The horizon was smeared with mist, and beyond the trench's edge 2 figures approached. One moved with steady but labored steps, his posture upright and head scanning from side to side. The other stumbled behind him, dragging one foot and clinging to the first cadet's arm. Tracy climbed the ridge to meet them halfway. The first was Vrek, a towering gray-skinned reptilian male from the Dralak Empire. His body armor had cracked along the shoulders and patches of ice crusted his back. His breath came out in thick, controlled bursts. The second was a slender humanoid female, one of the few from the water-based Elanan species. Her skin, which shimmered silver blue in normal conditions, had dulled to a lifeless gray. Her limbs trembled as if resisting rigor mortis. "She's freezing," Vrek said, his voice rough and accented. "I carried her from the East Range." Tracy nodded and turned, leading them into the trench. Inside the shelter, Fezishi shifted immediately, clearing space with her remaining good arm. Tors grabbed the last intact heat blanket and laid it over the Elanon girl as Vrek carefully lowered her to the ground. Tracy checked her pulse, weak but present. She didn't waste time speaking. She handed Rollin the water flask, gesturing for more snow to be melted. Vrek sat in silence for several minutes, watching Tracy as she worked. When she finally glanced at him, his gaze didn't hold mockery or skepticism. Only study. "You built this shelter?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, not looking up. "You've sustained all of them for 2 days?" 3 now, she corrected. He considered that for a moment. "That makes you the highest performing cadet here." "I didn't do it for performance. Doesn't change the outcome," he said. Tracy said nothing more. The Elanon girl stirred weakly, letting out a low moan as the warmth began seeping back into her muscles. Tracy sighed in relief. The shelter, now crowded with 6 bodies, had reached its limit. The air inside was heavy, and condensation dripped slowly from the ceiling, refreezing at the edges. The makeshift ventilation flap kept the environment breathable, but just barely. Tracy knew she had to expand it again. Later that afternoon, after checking everyone's vitals and reinforcing the base of the dome, she stepped outside and surveyed the horizon. The weather was holding, but the wind had begun to shift, subtle but distinct. A storm was coming. She returned to the shelter and crouched beside Tors. "I need your help." "Of course," he said. "We're going to build a second dome." He didn't ask why. He simply stood and grabbed his broken exosuit shell from the pile of repurposed parts. Together, they climbed further along the trench and began digging out a new section of snow, flattening the base, then compacting a wall using ice blocks reinforced with thermal compound from Tracy's melted rations. Fuzzy joined them next, her movements stiff but functional. She didn't speak, just began arranging the layered metal sheeting Tracy had stacked earlier. Raylon emerged last, carrying the leftover insulation foam from his wrist bracers. He handed it to Tracy wordlessly. She nodded in thanks. Over the next few hours, the second shelter took shape. It wasn't as elegant as the first, but it was solid. Tracy connected the two domes using a narrow passage built from ration containers stacked and wrapped in synthetic wrap, forming a windproof tunnel. Vrek took charge of stabilizing the tunnel's entrance, while Tracy oversaw heat distribution. As they finished sealing the structure, a piercing screech broke across the sky. All heads turned upward as a dark silhouette darted overhead, trailing smoke. The dropship. It wasn't landing. It was scanning. A beam of red light swept the area. The survival check. Once per day, the Academy passed overhead to track vitals and mark cadet positions. If a beacon was activated or if vitals dropped too low, the dropship would dispatch a drone for medical extraction. But those extracted were automatically disqualified. Tracy's wrist monitor buzzed twice, a signal confirming that her vitals, and those of her companions, remained within acceptable ranges. She exhaled slowly, but one set of vitals, somewhere nearby, must have failed. The ship lingered above the eastern ridge longer than expected. A drone detached from its hull and dropped from sight. Tracy looked at Vrek. "Someone didn't make it," she said. He didn't respond. That night, the storm arrived. The wind howled with fury, slamming into the trench walls and shaking both domes. Inside, Tracy double-checked every seal. She moved between shelters through the tunnel, delivering hot water and small portions of melted ration paste to the cadets. She made sure everyone was layered properly, rotated those closest to the heat source, and checked their oxygen levels. Torres tried to convince her to rest. So did Raylon. Even Fezzi blinked at her with weary concern. But she stayed up, walking slow circuits inside the narrow shelter, listening to the storm roar outside. At some point, she caught Vrek standing near the exit, staring into the dim blue of the swirling snow. "You're thinking about the ones still out there," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I don't have enough supplies to go after them." "I know." She stepped beside him. "If anyone else makes it to the trench by tomorrow morning, we let them in. No matter who, even the ones who mocked you, especially them." He turned toward her, brow furrowed. "You don't want revenge?" "No," she said simply. "I want them alive." He stared at her for several long seconds. Then he stepped aside. "You lead," he said. Tracy shook her head. "I didn't ask to lead. Doesn't change the fact." By morning, the storm had passed. The trench was quiet again, and at the edge of the ridge, barely visible through a curtain of wind-blown frost, two more figures were approaching. Tracy pulled on her gloves and stepped out. The shelter was no longer hers alone. It was the last refuge on a moon that had crushed the arrogance of the strong, and in doing so revealed the quiet resilience of the overlooked. She walked toward the new arrivals without hesitation. The doors would open again. Tracy trudged up the ridge in silence, the crunch of ice under her boots muffled by layers of wind-packed snow. Her arms ached from days of exertion, and her knees threatened to lock with every step, but she didn't slow. The two figures drawing closer moved like shadows, bent, cautious, and barely upright. She quickened her pace. The first was Ciro, a thin, angular male from the high-gravity world of Zentar. His joints were swollen, and blood had dried at the edges of his mouth where a cracked breathing valve had failed. He was carrying another cadet, Tenna, a small avian female from the Volari race, curled in his arms like a fragile animal. Her feathers were soaked with frost, her eyelids half closed. Ciro's eyes, normally sharp with pride, were dulled by exhaustion. Tracy reached them and nodded silently, taking Tenna's limp form from his arms. Ciro didn't argue. He merely collapsed to his knees, panting, and let his arms fall to his sides. She gestured toward the trench. "Follow me. We'll get you both warm." Inside the primary dome, the others had already begun preparing space. Fezzi was kneeling beside the heat chamber, checking the temperature regulators. Vrek had reinforced the far side of the tunnel wall with a new layer of snow bricks, sealing up a small leak that had formed during the storm. The air inside the dome now smelled faintly of metal, insulation, and steam, strangely comforting. Torres cleared a spot next to the Elenon girl, who had regained enough strength to sit upright. Tracy laid Tenna down gently and wrapped her in a reflective cloak. Rollin handed her a flask of warm broth brewed from the last of the nutrient pouches. She tilted it against the side of Tenna's beak and watched for any sign of swallowing. After a long moment, The girl's throat moved. "She's responding," Tracy said. Zero dropped beside her, sweat clinging to his brow despite the cold. He didn't speak, just rested his hand lightly against Tenna's arm and leaned his forehead against the dome wall. Tracy stood and stepped into the adjoining shelter. She needed space to think. The numbers had grown. The shelter now held 8 cadets. There was no more room, no more rations, no more energy sticks. What remained was improvisation, luck, and stubbornness. She sat down against the cold inner curve of the dome and stared at her boots. The crack in her left sole had grown wider. She would need to bind it soon or risk frostbite. But for now, her mind was already somewhere else. On the sky. The exam ended at midday. If the Academy followed protocol, the retrieval ship would arrive in less than 2 hours. If she timed it right, she could boil enough snow for one last batch of hot water to circulate between them all. It wouldn't be enough to undo what had happened, but it might be enough to hold them until extraction. Raylon entered quietly and sat beside her. He didn't speak at first. She appreciated that. He passed her a ration bar, half of his last one. She took it and bit into the brittle edge. "You know," he said, "none of us thought you'd make it through the first night." She raised an eyebrow. "That's not exactly a compliment." "No. But it makes what you've done even harder." She shrugged, chewing slowly. "I didn't do anything special. I just stayed alive. That's what leadership is. Not running ahead, not shouting orders, just making it easier for others to keep going." She said nothing. The words made her uneasy. Leadership wasn't something she wanted. She had come to prove herself, not to carry others. And yet, when the moments came that demanded action, she hadn't hesitated. A long, low hum split the sky. She shot to her feet, rushed outside, and scanned the air above. The clouds parted slowly to reveal the dark silver belly of the Academy dropship descending. Its stabilizers flared, scattering wind and snow in every direction. She shielded her eyes and raised her arm, activating the beacon on her wrist. Within seconds, the ship began to lower a loading platform. The others emerged behind her. Zero carried Tenna again, this time upright and alert, though still weak. Vrek stood beside Tracy, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the morning light. Feshi clicked her mandibles as she adjusted the straps of her pack. Tors and Rowland said nothing, only exchanged glances that needed no words. As the platform landed, a group of uniformed officers stepped out, 3 males and 1 female, each bearing the blue insignia of the Command Evaluation Corps. One of them, a stern-looking male with gray skin and narrow eyes, stepped forward and scanned the group. "Survivors from Cristar Trench?" he asked. "Yes," Tracy said. "All of you?" he asked. She nodded. "Everyone who made it here is alive." The officer glanced down at his data slate, lips tightening. "That makes 8 cadets out of 13. Tracy didn't ask about the others. The silence was enough. "You," the officer said, pointing to her, "come with me." She followed without question, walking alongside him to the edge of the platform where another officer waited. She was shorter, human, with streaks of white in her dark hair. Her uniform bore the rank insignia of a senior examiner. "Cadet Tracy Green," the woman said. "You've been observed." "I assumed so," Tracy replied. The woman didn't smile. She handed over a holopad. "This is your official performance report. You exceeded every metric: leadership, innovation, resourcefulness. You salvaged failed systems, created sustainable heating, and prevented casualties. That's never happened before in a Cristar trial." Tracy scanned the document briefly, then lowered it. "So what happens now?" "You've been recommended for the Command Fast Track program," the woman said. "And your shelter design is being reviewed for integration into future emergency training modules. The Council has requested a full debriefing." Tracy blinked. "Why?" The woman's expression softened slightly. "Because for a long time, humans were underestimated, considered primitive, emotionally unstable. Your performance rewrites that perception." I didn't do it for the reputation of my species." "That's exactly why it matters," the woman replied. The rest of the cadets were already being ushered onto the ship. Each offered medical assistance and survival debriefs. Feshi paused at the ramp and turned back to Tracy, raising a hand in quiet salute. Tracy nodded in return. As she stepped onto the platform, the cold wind of Cristar struck her one last time, sharp and bitter. She didn't flinch. She walked into the ship without looking back. 2 days later, she sat in a clean debriefing room on the central station orbiting the Academy. Her hands were no longer frostbitten, her lips no longer cracked. She wore a new uniform now, the black and silver of the command track. Her nameplate was still temporary. The instructor who sat across from her was one she remembered from orientation, an older male who had once told her, half-jokingly, that humans survived more out of accident than intent. He didn't joke now. "You've redefined our expectations, Cadet Green," he said. "Your file is now required reading." "I just followed logic," she replied. "And made tea." He chuckled. That, too. Later, when she walked the polished corridors of the station, others turned to watch. Some nodded. A few saluted. She kept her head down. She wasn't interested in fame. Her mind was still in the trench, still surrounded by frost and fire and cracked helmets and shivering fingers. She had gone to the frozen hell of Cristar to survive. She had returned with something far rarer, respect, and that would be enough.